I find it absolutely fascinating. If you sail around the Baltic, you can tell I'm addicted to cruising. I love it because it's a no-brainer, and also I can work. It was absolutely fascinating to start in Sweden and then go across to Estonia and then go to Finland and then go to St. Petersburg, because you started out with the Russians being the bad guys in Sweden, and then you're in Estonia where it's really somebody else, and then in Russia all they want to tell you about is the evil Swedes and the Nazis.
Yes.
And then you go to Finland, which tried to stay neutral, but had to war with both. And then we went to Gdansk, Poland, which is a whole different thing.
Which everybody dominated at one time or another.
Right, and then Denmark, which is yet another deal, stayed neutral, but had all kinds of, wartime
In fact, talk to some Germans, they still think of Gdansk as part of East Prussia. So
exactly. And in all that, I made a day trip to Berlin, and was fascinated to have a tour guide who was 42 and who took us to see Checkpoint Charlie and part of the wall, and said I think he was absolutely sincere, that he had no idea why the Russians had ruled this part of his city for so long. It was like he absolutely no idea about World War II and the aftermath of it and why Berlin was, and he was generally outraged that his city had been. And I thought, that's so interesting. Have they tried not to have a collective memory?
That's pretty rare, actually, because I lived in Germany 3 years, and particularly his generation, and the 68ers, as they were known, they have a very strong sense of their World War II heritage. In fact, that generation was the one, and maybe a little older than him, was the one that sort of turned to their, in fact, it would be older than him, more like my age, that turned to their parents in the late 60s. Their form of rebellion was not burning draft cards. Their form of rebellion was to demand of their parents, what did you do during the war? Why didn't you do something to stop the Nazis? And how could you have been complicit in all this? And they were shown, the generation after theirs, as a result, was then shown extensive films about what had happened and about the Holocaust, and a lot of education. And when I was living there, in fact, Schindler's List came out, and it basically became, for a lot of schools, it became mandatory viewing, and school groups were going to see it. So it's rare that you run across a German of that age who has such a poorly defined knowledge or sense of their own recent history.
I found it fascinating.
Yeah.
Your second book, then, A Small Boat of Great Sorrows, took Mr. Petrich to Germany.
Yes, he was living in Germany as a refugee with his wife, and there are a fair amount of Bosnian refugees in Germany.
Right.
Yeah, and then he's called upon to participate in an investigation of a war criminal, one still left over from the Second World War, and one who's on the loose from the most recent war in his country.
Is it possible to write a political thriller about Germany with sort of ignoring the whole war? I mean, when are these books set? They're not totally contemporary, are they?
No, they were set in the early 90s,
right.
And I don't think it's possible to write any thriller set in Germany even now without having at least some ghost kicking around from the Second World War.
Right.
In Germany, the politics, if you want to mention that word again, everything is influenced by the war. It's almost like the race issue in America.
Right.
Everything has its element from the war. If inflation starts going up too steeply, the Germans react very quickly because they think, oh no, it's another Weimar Republic that will lead us to a Hitler-like character. If immigration policy comes up, and they talk about too many immigrants, they get nervous and say, are we going to look like Nazis if we keep immigrants out, or don't relax our citizenship requirements? Everything is influenced by that issue.
Just in the same way that so much of British literature is about class.
Right, exactly.
I do think it's fascinating, and you're working on digressing for a moment, the book that will come out whenever it is, next year, that you're working on.
Next year.
Is also set in Germany.
It's set mostly in Germany and Switzerland, partly during the Second World War, partly during contemporary times, involving a historian who thinks he's on to something regarding a fellow who was a teenager during the war and was the son of a prominent arms merchant, and the son was in an ill-fated student resistance group in Berlin.
How does structuring a narrative like that differ from the ones that you've done before, where it's all sort of one time flow?
There was a little bit, actually, of going back to the Second World War and the small boat of great sorrows.
Right.
So it's just a little more difficult in the going back and forth. You have to make sure that your entry and exit points mesh pretty well so that it's not too jarring when you move from one time period to the other, and that there is some logical sense of transition between the two.
Today's books, it is, I think, increasingly difficult to use shame as a motive for a crime. I mean,
Yeah.
we're such a confessional society, you know, you can, I mean, who knows, Elliot Spitzer will probably turn out, you know, any time now to be on Oprah or
Right.
or have, you know, they were rushing to sign up the lady in that scandal for a book before you could turn around.
Yeah.
But in Germany, particularly with people who could be arrested for war crimes, shame actually does work, doesn't it?
It does. In
Or
fact,
maybe exposure more than shame.
Yeah, and there's a word they have, betroffen. It's how betroffen are you, and it sort of means shame. It sort of means contrition. It sort of means how aware are you of all this that you have to account for as a German. And I don't think it's quite as mentioned as it was, say, when I was there, when all these 50th anniversary of the end of the war events were coming along, and it was very much in everybody's mind. They were almost happy to move on, in a way, to dealing with the whole idea of the guilt of the German Democratic Republic, as it was called, the East Germans, because it kind of got them, it moved them on a little bit, so that they didn't dwell on the Second World War quite as much. Now they had this new bogeyman that a smaller part of the country had to atone for and confess for, that whole system of informants and whatnot in East Germany. And some of that becomes an issue in that book that I'm working on as well.
I've noticed that the Stasi, the East German police, have figured in some books as you know, the evildoers, in the same way that the SS are almost classic. Well, they are.
Yeah.
But I did wonder if, in part, one reason Germany was so happy to, you know, restructure itself that way. I mean, Germany, actually, of all European countries, is one of the youngest in terms of national unity. I mean, it really wasn't until the mid to late 19th century that the various German kingdoms, I mean, if you remember, Victoria's progeny were all married to various princes and whatever, so Germany actually doesn't have a very long history of being a single country in the same way that France, maybe.
No, they don't. And it reminds me of, I forget which comedian had a line when German reunification happened, and there was a lot of euphoria over it, and he said, I don't know, frankly, I view it sort of the same way I viewed the Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin reunion. I wasn't all that fond of their earlier work together. So it was a nice line. I think there were some people who thought, well, Germany reunited and a new Colossus, what will that mean in the long term? But,
well, it's pretty scary for anybody who you know, has looked at European history for the last 200 years, but they really have had movable borders. I mean, if you look at Alsace-Lorraine, if you look at Schleswig-Holstein, you know, below Denmark, and then if you look at East Prussia and Poland, I mean, Poland has been partitioned and partitioned.
Yes, and ceased to exist for a while.
I mean, the French, Napoleon just tromped all over them, and Germany,
the
Russia.
Habsburgs did. True.
So, you know, as you said, probably one of the most difficult issues is when you get to this boundary issue is figuring out where to draw them, you know, on old political maps.
Yeah, but of course then you've got the unified Europe and one currency and the economic unity, and I think that puts a lot of those fears to rest.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, what happened in A Small Boat of Great Sorrows? Petrish, we know, survives, which was actually a big question on Lie in the Dark, was would he even make it through the book?
Even make it through it, and he does, and then it becomes a bigger problem for him trying to survive the machinations of these different war crimes characters who may have some connections or may not, even across the generations.
Did you feel that his story was done, because you haven't written about him again?
Right, I haven't. I didn't want to write a series. I prefer moving on to a new set of characters. I think Vlado's still out there somewhere kicking around, and maybe someday I'll get back to him, but my preference was to move on to other areas of the world and to other characters.
And so where did you go with Book 3?
Book 3, I went to the Afghan-Pakistan border area, which is still an interesting area. It's probably is the area where bin Laden is still hiding out. And I set it in the months after 9/11, when the Taliban was on the verge of being run out of the country and things were very unstable there, and you had various ne'er-do-wells trying to get in or out with various interests which were competing. And my characters were a U.S. journalist and his young Pakistani tribal area born fixer who was fixer translator who was going to help him get across the border.